Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Servos. I'm the Commercialization Education Director with Fast Forward Medical Innovation. Very pleased to have you join us this afternoon for what is technically lecture number 2 as part of our innovation program with the Rogel Cancer Center. And we're going to talk about the commercial potential of oncology therapeutics. But before we introduce our speaker, I do have a couple things that I would like to cover and remind everyone of. Please mute your microphone today unless you're asking a question. We do encourage questions. So when the time is right, you can unmute yourself and ask. You can also use the chat feature if you'd like to submit a question. Our staff will be monitoring that chat to answer those questions, as well as share some additional links to some resources. And I want to remind everyone that this presentation is being recorded, and we will share that recording post-event. The innovation program is the new initiative between the Rogel Cancer Center, Fast Forward Medical Innovation, and the Michigan Drug Discovery Program here on campus. And it does consist of 2 major components, the lecture series, as I just referenced, as well as a project-based development course. The lecture series was supposed to start last week with a lecture from Dr. Wang on trends in oncology therapeutic development. We had to reschedule that. It has been scheduled for Wednesday, January 31st, so you have not missed it, and you have a chance to view that webinar if you want to go to our website now and register for that. Today, as I mentioned, is lecture number 2. And then next week on the 24th, we're going to hear from Dr. Sirpicki on some preclinical activities for advancing oncology therapeutics. Again, some more preclinical talk on February the 7th from Dr. Parabo. And then the lecture series will finish up mid-Feb on the clinical phase of oncology target and therapeutic development. So please join us for these remaining webinars. And again, you can go to our website to register to view those, or we can send direct links in the chat feature today as we're hearing from our speaker. But one of the other things that I wanted to mention to the audience today is this project-based course, which begins March 8th. So if you have a project, perhaps early stage, and you're looking for mentorship and guidance and connection into resources across campus, please join us or consider joining us for this program. We are going to meet as a group every other Friday from 2 to 3 p.m., starting on that March 8th date, stretching several different weeks. We can get you the schedule, but really the course is designed to plug you in and help you build what we would describe as a business case for the development of your therapeutic. And the goal is to help you secure some development funding and really accelerate that process for you. Always happy to answer any more questions. You can reach out to me or Brad or anybody else on the call, and travel to our website for more information. Okay, so with that, I am going to turn things over now to FFMI's Managing Director, Brad Martin, to introduce our speaker.
Yeah, thanks, John. Just very quickly before I turn it over to Anurag, I have a couple of thank yous I need to get out of the way here. As John mentioned, I'm Brad Martin. I'm the Director for Fast Forward Medical Innovation in the Office of Research at the Medical School. And first and foremost, I need to thank John and Catherine. They've become so adept at pulling together these courses and executing these programs. I've forgotten how much work it is, and so I need to thank them for their tremendous efforts in pulling this together. Secondly, I want to thank Eric Fearon. Some of you may or may not know that we run a very similar program at the Cardiovascular Center called the Aikens Innovation Academy. It's been very successful, I think, particularly at the center level because of the diverse faculty. And so I guess it was probably last summer we approached Eric about a similar program in the Cancer Center focused on oncology therapeutic development, and he could not have been more supportive. And his goal here, when I asked him, what does success look like? What does a win look like to you? His comment was that he wants to set up cancer center investigators like yourselves to succeed in follow-on funding, whether it be from an extramural grant or investors such as Agarwal. And so that's really the goal here. And so I appreciate his foresight and his support for the faculty at the Cancer Center. And so with that, I want to introduce today's speaker here. We're just thrilled to have Anurag Agarwal with us today. He is a partner at Osage University Ventures. They are in the Philadelphia area, and he has been in their life science team since 2017. For those of you that don't know, Osage is a venture capital group that really focuses on working with university tech transfer offices to identify compelling research at universities and bring it to the point of being a startup and commercializing it. I think to date, they've launched over 130 companies. Anurag has been very involved in some of the life science companies. And so he's very well positioned to give us a talk today about current trends in the investment and commercialization side of things with regards to oncology therapeutics. He's got his PhD in molecular cellular biology from WashU, spent time at the Boston Consulting Group. So again, a very experienced individual in oncology therapeutic development. And so we're happy to have him here. Anurag, I'll leave it to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah. I hope everybody can hear me.
Yes.
We can.
Thanks, Brad, for the introduction. And I'm very glad to be here. If at any point I start speaking too fast, as I tend to do, please let me know and I will try to slow down. But as Brad mentioned, I will try to cover a few things in this presentation, some of the trends, and give some key points on what to think about, what things to consider when considering the commercial potential of the technology. This would be from the lens of both the target product profile one should build, and how do you kind of think about your competitive edge in those fields. So I think I can share my screen, correct? Awesome. And I will. So this is, let me see if you guys can see the full screen. I need to swap the displays.
Yep, we're seeing the full slide.
Yep.
Awesome. So, so we can get started. Brad gave a quick introduction on OUP. I wanted to start with that. OUP, Osage University Partners, is a venture fund that is based outside the Philadelphia city. We have $800 million under the management over the last 12 years that we have been operating across 4 funds. We are usually the leading venture capital fund that invests in university spin-out, both on the life science and the tech side. I am on the life science team and therefore, more appropriate for this presentation, but we have a very similar team on the tech side as well. As Brad mentioned, we partner with leading institutions like Michigan, which is actually one of our first partners as OUP had started and one of the oldest. And by partnering with such institutions, we end up evaluating 1,000 new startups every year. And those are new startups. And on top of that, we evaluate existing startups over the years multiple times as well. So there's a lot of startups that any venture capital fund evaluates every year. And with that evaluation, even with 1,000 new startups over the last 12 years, we have only invested in 80 life science companies and 130 total portfolio companies. So as you can see, this leads to a very small percent of the companies actually, finally are able to make the bar to get the investment. That's a quick overview on OUP. And for the commercial side, I wanted to kind of give an overview of what I would like to cover. First, thinking about the commercial potential, it's good to pay attention to the investment trends in oncology from the venture world that form the beginning of the company's journey to drug development. Finally, the exits and how they are looking, they influence the way investments, VCs make investments, and will eventually also influence what entrepreneurs and researchers are focusing on. Now, with those two in mind, I think the next bits would be like kind of thinking about areas when you're thinking about your own oncology startups. One would be like defining what's the target product profile that you're looking to build, evaluating its commercial potential with that target profile in mind. And at the end, I'll try to finish in like 35 to 40 minutes and leave about 20 minutes for questions. However, if people have questions in the middle as I'm going through the slides, as mentioned, please send them over in the chat and we'll try to cover them during the presentation or at the end as appropriate. I hope I'm clear, and if there are no questions so far on the presentation, I will continue and get into some high-level data that I'm sharing from different resources that I've pulled together. So as you can see, as everybody's familiar right now, there has been this sentiment that the markets are really bad, both on the private and the public side. And when we say the markets are bad, they generally tend to be in a very relative terms. They are really bad compared to what they were during the pandemic. And that is because of the macroeconomics that was around in the pandemic. However, if you take a wider lens back in 2029, I think the markets may look much better, or at least similar to what they were in 2029. So it's just that we have gone back to the time before pandemic and it then been really bad. So here on the graph, what I'm trying to show, kind of depict the same thing. It's what it shows in the bar graph is global biotech VC funding in therapeutics by quarter from 2019 to 2023. And then the blue line shows the number of startups that are getting funded. As you can see, the pandemic time created a frenzy of investments that has since declined, from all to almost 50% of what we had seen back in the pandemic days. Similarly, the number of startups that are getting funded, represented by the blue line, has also declined by almost 1/3, which is even more, than the total dollars being reduced, which is an interesting trend because I think what we are seeing is even though 1/3 of the companies are being funded, only the capital has reduced by half, which equates to more capital going into each companies. So investors are being more selective about the investments, but when they get conviction, they're investing many more dollars. Also, if you compare 2023 to 2019, what is interesting to see is our investment dollars have almost gone 3 times, up by 3 times, but the number of startups that are being funded are barely up. This again leads to this thinking that in this current market, few startups are being funded, or few companies are getting venture fundings, but the ones that are, they are being funded with really large amount of capital so that they can actually execute and deliver data that can generate value. So overall, the markets have soured a little bit, but compared to the historical trends, I think we are still sitting on a very robust venture activity in therapeutics overall, which includes all different indications. But if we kind of then double click into the entire therapeutics area and look at different areas where investment is going, what we'll see is oncology has always been the favorite for venture financing. If you look at 2019 to 2021, almost 40 to 45% of the funding was going into oncology. And that is similarly reflected in OUP's portfolio. Almost half of our portfolio is also oncology startups. However, one trend that we have seen in 2022 and has continued in 2023 is this real contraction in oncology startups being funded. They're still one of the largest fraction, but they have shrunk quite a bit. And the focus has moved a little bit towards immunology targets. There are several reasons that are driving this shift. One, we have overinvested in oncology in the past decade. And so we are seeing those investments bear fruit and really change the treatment landscape. So people are waiting for this landscape to evolve and understand the next unmet need before the investments go in again. So there has been a little bit of a pause in oncology, but still remains one of the highest or one of the most focused areas of investment for the VC world. Not only investments, venture investments are a reflection of what we see in the M&A side, because if there is an exit potential that is high, the investment pace will be high in that area as venture investors look to make a return on their money. And what I'm showing here is, from 2017 to 2022, these are private M&As that have happened. And what you'll see is oncology is by far the top indication where M&As have happened. By numbers, there were 25 oncology M&As. Also, they are the largest by where there has been $1 billion exits that have been greater than $1 billion. 9 of them compared to the platform technology 6 as a second. And the other striking part is that it has been one of the fastest to exit as well, 3.4 years from the initial funding. And so oncology continues to be this area of high M&A activity with large upfronts and a quick exit, which forms all the basis for attractive venture investments. And this trend has continued in 2023, even though the venture investments have pulled back. The M&As have really been strong, and I'm highlighting some really recent, M&As that have happened in the last year. Most of them are these public companies right now. And what you'll see is these are really large exits. Seagen, $43 billion, which is a commercial stage company. Immunogen, after phase 3 approval, phase 3 data, $10 billion. RayzeBio, which is in the phase 3, is a $4 billion exits. These are really multi-billion-dollar exits. And the two other striking features of the M&A that we are seeing is, one, in the acquirer space. One thing that's striking is we are seeing 6 different acquirers. That means every pharma plays in this space and is willing to spend money to acquire companies with good clinical data. So this gives you the idea that there's not only 1 or 2 acquirers that somebody is betting. This is a competitive field for the pharma itself. Then the other is the modality space. What we are seeing is the oncology is a place where we have seen most of the new modalities enter. So if you look at ADCs, we have acquisitions there. We have acquisitions in radiopharma, which is a new modality that is coming up. T-cell engagers or bispecific molecules, we're seeing acquisitions in there. These are on top of cell therapy acquisitions we had seen from 2015 to 2020. Small molecules and antibodies, they're always there. But we are seeing these new modalities being accepted by the pharma, being acquired, and rewarding these investors who have taken the bet a few years back. And now, as they are getting rewarded with these new modalities, that money is going to flow back into companies and investing in other oncology startups as they identify new unmet areas. So I think overall, we see good venture investments. Oncology remains a top area of investments with very robust M&A activity that I think is likely to continue in 2024 as well, which kind of paves the ground for a really rich financial environment for doing oncology startups. I'll take a pause here and see if there are any questions before we start going into the second part of the presentation and talk about more of the target product profile. If none, then can you guys still see the full screen, or is that it has its tab?
You got to go into presenter view. So there you go.
Perfect. Okay, perfect. That's right. I wanted to make sure. Maybe before we go to the target product profile, one thing that I would say is, that contraction that we have seen in oncology, it may be worth spending a few minutes to highlight where has that contraction happened. So there are a few things that we have seen that have lost a lot of investor interest. One has been cell therapies. After the great success of CAR-Ts in liquid tumors, we made a lot of investment trying to crack the solid tumor space. And however, that has not yielded much success. And that has resulted in investors pulling back in cell therapy for oncology, because really trying to understand what we need to solve and then trying to find the best technology to solve those issues. The second has been an IO space, traditional checkpoint inhibitors, cytokine space. From 2015 to 2020, there was gigantic amount of investments made in IO companies. Super early stage investments that then mature to the clinic. But the clinical data could never match what we saw with PD-1, either alone or in combination. That has raised question on, we don't know, these preclinical models may not be predictive. We don't really know what issues we are trying to solve, and therefore maybe not suited to understand the best technology to take forward. And doing the experiment, it takes a while to get to the clinic and get the answer to the experiment. Is a very expensive way. So investors have tried to pull back on that as well. I think the third area that has seen a lot of contraction as well has been novel target biology. We had done that a lot previously, but now the risk appetite for investors have reduced a little bit. And so they have focused more on validated targeted targets validated biology, which we were not able to pursue previously due to, various reasons. But now with our expanded toolkits, we may be able to. For the same thing, ADCs are a novel take on chemotherapies. Radiopharma is a novel take on radiation oncology. T-cell engagers is a slightly new way of taking the IO companies. We are seeing that new technologies are reinvigorating the old dogmas that were known to be very critical, but were not explored. And so that's where the focus has more shifted versus completely novel targets and novel biology, which takes a while to get de-risked. So that has been the big shift that we see in oncology space, and places where investors have tend to move away in the recent years. So I think that concludes on overall the financing environment, the trends that we have been seeing in the marketplace here. I think in the next part of the segment, what I'll do is kind of talk more about as you are building your startup, what are things to consider from your target product profile. And what I've done in this slide is it's kind of broken it down into 3 attributes. What is the preclinical profile you want? What's the clinical profile? You have clinical things you have to consider, and what are the commercial things one has to consider, even before you launch into your drug development pathway. Again, this list is not going to be comprehensive. Not all the aspects are going to be applicable to every modality or every therapies, but this is just to give a flavor of what kind of things we should be considering before even launching on a program. And as we go into the drug development journey, we will use these guidelines to make trade-offs. We will not always hit on every aspect, and so people have to decide, am I okay to compromise on one because another aspect looks really good? And that's where the team really comes in, because drug development is not black and white. It always works in the gray. But this hopefully will give a good, robust discussion of things to consider. I have listed these here, and I'll go through each one of them in some depth and give case studies as we go. But really, the major focus will be on competitive difference, tumor types treated, and so on. So let me start with preclinical. Things that we consider, and again, in oncology, what are we defining as target profile is? What kind of efficacy we want to see with our drug? What kind of doses we will take into humans? What is an acceptable dose that we can give in the humans? What is an acceptable route of administration? How frequently would we need to dose? What is the toxicology, preclinical toxicology we will accept? And what are the manufacturing parameters that we will have to live by to make this drug actually be scaled up to put in the clinic with hundreds and thousands of the patients? With those preclinical attributes, along with it, you start thinking about the clinical aspects of what patient selection criteria are we going to use? Is there going to be one? Are we going to treat all cancer patients? Is there going to be a clinical, what is the clinical need in the places where we are going? What is the line of the treatment? What is the expectations on the duration of response? And then finally, what is the regulatory path then? Is it an accelerated approval on a single arm study? Is it a placebo-controlled PFS study? Is it an overall survival study? All of these are an implication of how much financing, how long will it take for the drug to be approved? And can we set out upfront to say, if I have choice, what aspects will I choose in it? Where the regulatory path is most amenable to the fastest approval? And finally, on the commercial side, this really depends on the two decisions you make on the first 2 aspects. Is what tumor types you're treating. Sarcomas are small. Breast cancers, prostate cancers, lung cancers are really large populations, so they have different commercial potentials. What is the response rate that we would expect in these to be successful? In solid tumors like pancreatic, 20% response rates can be very valuable. Versus if you are in NHL, now we need 70 to 80% response rates with 50% CRs to be actually competitive in the field. So what is there a threshold we need to define of what we need to see to be successful? And then third is, with that, what is a competitive difference? It could be the efficacy, or it could be something else that we'll talk about in a case study. So these are just different attributes that one considers when thinking about, how to build a target product profile. As you go in the drug development, one will double click into all of these different aspects and get into much more granularity. But at the highest level, when I kind of step back and think, what do I look for when I'm thinking about an investment? And when I first talk to the company, these are kind of things that come to my mind. Not that they will have an answers to everything, but could I get directional comfort into some of these so that I can understand the risk one has on the table? So I'll take a pause again and see if there were any questions. And if not, I'll continue to move to each of these segments. Sounds like nothing on the questions. So going through the preclinical piece, and I'll go through each one of them one by one. So xenograft efficacy. This is something, investors focus heavily on. What are we looking to see in our xenograft studies? Is it tumor static effects? Is it growth inhibition? Or is it actually tumor regression? In the current market, our belief is that investors are looking for tumor regression. Just slowing down the growth of the tumor or not letting the tumor grow at all does not garner as much attention or as much excitement among investors. Also, how often are you seeing those xenograph effects? Are you seeing regression in 1 in 100 models? Or are you seeing it in 30 of the 100 models? That kind of gives you an idea of how broadly would this be applicable. And so that's something also investors are quite interested in. And what paradigm of treatment are we using? Are we actually using treatment at very large tumors? Or are we treating them in very small tumors? Or are we even treating them preventatively? I think our investors' bias has always been to see larger tumors that are greater than 200 millimeter cube in a treatment paradigm that is the most reflective of the toughest, test your drug will go through. And seeing regressions in that in 20 to 30% of the models tested, I think is a good bar to set for getting investor interest. So, this is one place where we see a lot of, academic work gets excited about, tumor growth inhibitions. And a lot of times it's been pointed out that, hey, PD-1s did not show regressions, and they were one of the most successful cancer drugs. Completely understandable, but I also point out that PD-1 was developed by pharma and not by small biotechs mostly because, again, biotechs are looking to be efficient in capital and looking at relative investment opportunities. And sometimes, they don't always get it right. So it's not something that if an investor is looking for that means that they've got the right answer to find the most successful oncology drug, but it's just the kind of the guardrails that we work with to be able to prioritize things that we are seeing. I think the second one is human dose. This comes a little later in the development, in the early stages. It's not something on top of mind, but there are critical calculations to be made. They depend on what is the dose where you're seeing sensitivity, where you're seeing cell killing, both in the sensitive and insensitive cell lines. Sometimes we see academic world showing 10 to 50 micromolar of drugs in vitro killing the cells. I think that's less interesting versus what people really want to see is seeing some micromolar concentrations where you're able to kill 50 to 90% of the cells in most of your cell lines. And that starts becoming a really attractive molecule because then you can have doses in humans that are acceptable. And this translates to the next point of given what you're seeing in vitro and in vivo, what is your human dose prediction? And generally, this is not that big of a concern unless you go into very high doses. Like, aspirin is taken at 500, milligrams 4 times a day, I believe. You can take 2 grams of the drug. But giving so much of drug comes with its own liabilities of off-target effects, GI issues, and several other things that can raise eyebrows from investors as well. So something to keep in mind for the later stages of development and not in early, but good to set benchmarks while you're developing so that you can ensure that the drug you are selecting is able to meet those. And just, I'll keep going till I hear any questions being asked or somebody pausing me rather than pausing intermittently and asking for it. So please feel free to interrupt if there are any questions. I think the next is the route of administration. Again, with oncology, there's a lot of freedom on route of administration. Oral, sub-Q, IV, direct tumor. All of these are acceptable. Delivery mechanisms. However, this really very well ties into the next one of frequency of dosing. Now, if you're an older drug, with cancer patients, you can give them thrice a day and they will tolerate. They'll be able to stick to it. But now if you have to take it every few hours, then it becomes a difficult drug. Or if it's an IV drug that you have to take every day, then that's not a feasible option, as the patient would have to go to an infusion center to get it. Also, if it's an IV drug and the infusion takes 4 hours and you have to do it every 2 days, maybe that's also not possible. So there is a balance of what is the route of administration, how frequently it is being administered. That does form the basis of being succeeding in the market. So something to think about when you are building your TPP. Similarly, if you have a sub-Q dosing, which I haven't written here, I believe fulvestrant is given as a 5 milligram injections subcutaneously. It's a very painful, but it's done once every 6 months. Now, if you had a 5 mil injection that you have to give every week, maybe that's not feasible from the patient's perspective as well, and they may prefer alternative treatment. So the route of administration, though there is a route of administration and frequency, has a lot of leeway in oncology, but it can become very, a key point in differentiating with other companies. And we'll come back to this when we talk about the commercial aspects. In the next 2 points on covering on the preclinical side has been toxicology and manufacturing. I think this is something we pay less attention to initially and more at the later stage of preclinical development. Is what tox species are we using? Is it going to be mouse or rats and dogs, rats and pigs, rats and NHPs? And they all have different costs, different timelines, different challenges associated with them. And there has to be good rationale for it. So thinking upfront is, if you want to do a very cost-effective development, maybe sticking to drugs where we can use rats and dogs is the cheapest way to go, rather than having to go to NHPs. Secondly, one has to consider, depending on the tumor types one is going, what is an acceptable tox? For example, with immunotherapy that already gives you GI and skin tox, having another drug combined with a severe GI toxicity will really hamper the development in the clinic. And therefore, maybe that's not an acceptable tox if the idea is to develop it in combination with PD-1s. And so you have to think about what's the standard of care, what's the development path, and what is an acceptable tox for one in this space. Again, oncology can tolerate a lot of toxicology if you have the efficacy, but it may really impact the development path. And that's something that one even has to consider before even going down that path. And finally, manufacturing, this is something where pharma is exceptionally focused on, is, how clinical trials in phase 1 and phase 2 are okay. But when you start going to phase 3, you really are treating thousands of the patients for years. And that requires a large amount of drug to be produced. So what are these yields looking like for small molecule antibodies? Are they consistent? In cell therapy, we are really focusing on turnaround time, which, over time has come down dramatically. Radiotherapy, if you can choose any radioisotope, what's your supply chain going to look at different radioisotope to consider which one to choose? If you can choose lutetium and actinium both, is it easier to use lutetium because it's more available, has a longer half-life? Those are the kind of manufacturing and supply chain consideration one has to consider. And, this is always a trade-off. Maybe, and I'll take a radiotherapy example. Maybe actinium is tougher to get, but it shows you the best efficacy. Lutetium is less effective, but easier to get. Now, this is the management decision on which one should go with in the clinic first. Should I be able to treat less patients, but show more efficacy, or treat more patients and with slightly less efficacy? I think those are kind of the key consideration that the management has to make the decision on. And there may not be a right answer, but something that the entire team needs to align on upfront to be able to make the right decisions. So I think those were the high-level preclinical things that one has to consider or think about in the drug development. I think the next I'll move on to is the clinical aspects, and I think more people in this in this group may be familiar with this one. First is patient selection criteria. Do we want to treat every cancer patient with this drug? Like, let's say chemotherapies are more widely, used in cancers, or do we have patient selection criteria? This can be from tumor types to their, epithelial versus, stromal types and different categories that are within it, or they may be even more genetically defined, or or defined in some other way. And so, kind of thinking about what is our acceptable thing. Investors in this world really like drugs that are targeted to specific patients, so that we can treat a handful of the patients and be able to get a good signal into efficacy. But the next part of selecting patients one has to consider is, what tests are we going to use to conduct this? Sometimes there are these complicated RNA-seq or in vitro culture mechanism based on which you can look at sensitivity of patient, but those are not clinically very adaptable or usable when you're running a trial. Versus a liquid biopsy is easier, and getting a fresh IHC, fresh biopsy, may be much more difficult. So one has to consider, how are we going to select these patients and how does it impact my clinical trial? Similarly, if we do select patients, do we want to increase our sensitivity, but have low specificity, so that we have very few patients, but we know that all of them will respond? That means the trial recruitment will be slow. Or do we want to relax our selection criteria so that we know maybe 50% of the patients respond, but at least I'll be able to move through the clinic faster? And so those are, again, decisions that are, there is no right answer, but one has to kind of think about what is the philosophy that the team wants to use when going into the clinic. The clinical need and the line of treatment. This is again a very, very critical question which closely ties to the commercial potential of the drug as well. Let's say we are going into lung cancer. There's a certain standard of care there. If it's an EGFR mutated cancer, there's a certain standard of care. And not only that the current standard of care when you think about developing the drug, but there are drugs which are in phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 development. And they will change the standard of care as your drug enters the clinic in 3 to 4 years. So one doesn't not only has to think about the standard of care that exists today, but also how is it going to change in the near term? That is going to change the dynamics of these patients, prevent some opportunities or open new doors. And I think looking forward 4 to 5 years and understanding how the landscape of standard of care will change is very critical. But the other thing is, based on the changing standard of care, the efficacy benchmarks have to change. For example, again, as we talked about, in liquid tumors, or in multiple myeloma, for example, getting a partial response is not considered really good. You have to really get a complete response or a very good PR in like 70% or 50% of the patients. But if you go into sarcoma patients, 15 to 20% of responses can be amazing with no complete response. So you have to really think about which tumor types you're going, what is the current standard of care, how it's evolving, and how is it changing the benchmarks of what a successful therapy needs to show. And that really will help you define what will be a first indication where you think you should take your drug first. And that kind of very much relates to the regulatory path, as we talked about, is, are you looking for an accelerated approval, or are you looking for a more of a standard of care control arm, and so on. Now, I think I'm going to speed up a little bit so that we can go through this. But just in the case study, I wanted to show you on the osimertinib's case study and this EGFR mutated lung cancer, how it has changed the landscape. Osimertinib was first approved in the second line in advanced cancer in end of 2015. Soon in 2018, it got approved in the first line. Within 3 years, it moved up one line of treatment. In the next 3 years, osimertinib even moved up and moved into earlier patients in adjuvant setting, people who were just getting their tumors resected, and they were not even advanced patients. And then finally, more recently, osimertinib is going to get approval in their first-line therapy, but with combination of chemo. And so, as you see, like osimertinib over in this 8 to 10 years has completely changed of how it is being used in the clinic. And what's the impact of that is that progression-free survival of these patients have gone from 10 months from the first generation EGFR inhibitors to 30 months in osimertinib plus chemo combination. Now, this means that you will have less patients available for your clinical trial because they'll all be responding to these drugs. Also, this means that they have been on osimertinib for a very long time. They developed different kinds of resistance than what we had seen when they were in the second line. Also, they may not present with CNS metastases anymore, as osimertinib is better at preventing those. So these kind of can restrict what population you are targeting and what can be treated now. But it can also present with new opportunities. Now, because osimertinib has moved up in the line so much, it is still not sure what the second line standard of care is. And the benchmarks may be very easy to be met. And so therefore, these changing landscape can both challenge development in certain areas, but can also open opportunities in in other areas. And we've seen this happen in liquid tumors most dramatically with both CAR Ts and bispecific antibodies that have been developed. I think the last one to go is commercial, and then this one hopefully will be, a much more deeper discussion. That we've always talked about what tumor types you go, and when I before my venture world, I always used to think is, let me just start with the incidence of the tumor type. If I can treat 30% of those patients and multiply that by $200,000 that I can get for each patient, and that would be my commercial potential. However, things are a little bit more complicated like that, and I wanted to show this graph because what this really shows is, on the left-hand side, it shows the new cases by cancer types, and on the right side, it shows the new deaths. Remember, when you're starting a new treatment, they are generally going in the last line of treatment. And so the number of people dying is really the late stage patients that you may be getting access to initially. And what this graph interestingly shows is, if you see breast cancer, which accounts for 15% of the cases, but it only accounts for 7% of the deaths. Again, so you've almost cut that into a half when you think about your commercial potential. On the other hand, if you look at prostate, which accounts for 15% of the cancer incidence, but it's not even in the top 4 cancer types of causing death because the standard of care is so good. On the other hand, lung and colon, while they're only 12 and 8% in incidence, they account for almost 21%, at least for lung, in deaths. That means, this is really a big unmet need because it is accounting for a disproportionate amount of deaths, and the standard of care are currently not very good. So one has to consider not only the incidence population and of how large it is, but also what are the late stage and salvage patients one initially can treat where we have to show our POC. But then if you can move on upper lines of treatment, the incidence cases become more valuable to understand what is the long-term potential of the drug. And this can really be true for prostate cancers, where the late-stage patients are limited. But if you can move up in the lines of treatment, then there's a really, really big prize because of large patient population, incident patient population. I talked about target response rate. This is again something that NHL is a great example. It has really changed the way therapies are seen in the clinic. If you look at the first line therapies of R-CHOP, there was a 75% complete response. That has been on standard of care for a very long time. CAR Ts started showing 50% complete response. They have complicated manufacturing. They needed ICUs for CRS management. On the other hand, recently, bispecifics are starting to show 30 to 40% complete responses, and they have much simpler manufacturing and non-ICU requirements. And so, but all of these are very high response rates. And so as you're developing new therapies, you have to think about, can my therapy meet these benchmarks? And how are they going to move in investors' mind? Like now when we look at liquid NHL, earlier we used to focus on complete response at 28 days. Then it slowly moved to complete response at 6 months. Now people also want to look at what is a long-term complete response rate, because that's only when you are going to get, you'll be able to move to earlier lines of therapy. So you have to be in tune with the market and how they're thinking about what is the benchmark for success here. And I think the last one is this competitive difference. And I've taken a case study for prostate cancer, where, I've taken 3 therapies that have recently been in the clinic, one approved, like radiotherapy, which is approved, bispecifics, which are showing really good data in phase 2, and some ADCs in phase 1 that are showing very encouraging data. No. So if I look at response rates, I would say, hey, everybody should take radiotherapy because they have the highest response rate. But their toxicities are also quite high. They have to deliver IV. Their manufacturing is complex, and you need specialized centers to get those treatments. That may not be every patient. If you, at least from our understanding, if you talk to prostate cancer docs, they are so used to oral therapies because all of the other standard of care are oral, that the docs are not used to managing complex modalities. It will take time for them to get comfortable. So if you can have an oral small molecule, maybe even a slightly lesser efficacious drug, maybe acceptable in the market. On the other hand, again, toxicology, these patients are old. The drugs they're currently taking have very limited side effects. And so for them to take complex therapies like bispecific, which is causing cytokine storms or neurological symptoms, it takes a while for the docs to become comfortable with that. And if that is the case, you have to match it with very high efficacy for them to take that risk. So it's not always that the high response rate, the drug that is most efficacious wins. But it's also about different patient population. Different oncologists have different preferences in different areas that can drive some, adoption and success. Like, again, large population of prostate cancer patients are in the community hospitals. They want to not move away to big centers and stay there for 6 months to get therapies. They want to stay home and get the therapies, in their own community. So, drugs that can go there can be successful. So there are other considerations of defining how you really define your competitive advantage. It could be in response rate, it could be in safety, it could be in how you deliver the drug, or it could be where the drug is delivered. So one has to consider this advantage in a more holistic way than at the highest level of thinking the most efficacious drug will always be the winner. So I think that was the last one that kind of I had about thinking about your competitive edge, which may not be as simple, straightforward. But I think these are the things that it also gives you ideas of how investors are thinking about different spaces when we're thinking about investing in new drugs.
Anurag, that was fantastic. I really appreciate that. That was exactly the kind of content we were looking for. I think, quite honestly, it's the kind of viewpoint that our faculty doesn't hear often enough. So it's a refreshing change of pace. Any questions from the audience? One of the things that I had a question about was you had that slide with the timeline showing the development for that EGFR inhibitor. What was the data that was acquired in those early clinical trials that allowed it to move from a third-line therapy to a first-line therapy?
Yeah, so I mean, the way it was done was the one that it could do it. It's an EGFR inhibitor, and was AstraZeneca started with the third line. They showed really good responses, and after that, they saw that they were much in the preclinical models. They were much better than the first line inhibitors. So because they worked in the second line, doctors were more comfortable, and they said, okay, let's try head to head with the first line inhibitors and see if we can increase. And they showed really amazing data. And they could have been happy there, right? Like if they were first line already, they could have sat there. But if another EGFR inhibitor came and combined it with chemo and showed it better than osimertinib, AstraZeneca would have lost that lead. So they are continuously trying to increase the bar so that a competitor has to meet that bar to replace them. And the earlier lines of therapy you are, more and more incident population you are capturing and not the salvage population, which increases your commercial potential. Like, I think osimertinib, like with this market, has gone from like few $1 billion to almost going to be a $10 billion drug, which is again a great development strategy from AstraZeneca. And this is where your clinical team is really good to understand what's a quick win, where we can then, based on that success, we can start taking more risky development paths.
Yep. Interesting. We've also got a question here asking, what do investors such as yourself think about personalized medicine? How about RNA therapeutics?
You know, oligotherapeutics is one thing that has not really gone into cancer well because of the delivery issues. One that has gone has been checkpoint therapeutics, which is delivering CpG oligos directly in the tumors. They did it in melanoma because those tumors are accessible, but it has not been a great area of investment from the venture world. Personalized medicine, on the other hand, been amazing. One thing that the market has shifted towards is earlier, we used to find exceptionally small patient population, 500 patients. And that will garner a lot of investor interest, even though commercially those drugs won't do well. But there's a great POC. So, but nowadays investors are kind of wary of that. They want a significant patient population that can lead to a couple of $1 billion in drug opportunities. Going to 500 may be okay if you have a very clear line of sight to a much larger population, and it really is translatable from the small population to the large. But personalized medicine, maybe it's a little bit of like answering not too personalized, but not completely open to all tumor types.
Right. Good question. Thanks, Mats. Any other questions from the audience? Chance to pick the mind of the investor. Evidently not. Oh.
I just see James asked one question.
Yep.
You know, the timeline that I'd shown was for private exits. I think investors prefer to exit as early as they can if the return is there. However, I mean, there is no right path. I mean, you know, you can start the company as early as you can. In this current market, people are looking, as I said, more around the DC stage asset, which can enter the clinic in the next year to 2 years, and maybe get data in 3 years to 4 years. That's what the horizon people are looking at. But some of these companies that I mentioned have been funded for 6, 7 years. I think if you're creating value that is de-risking the pathway and is continuing to garner investor interest, I think it's fine. We are not always looking to that the round that you're raising should lead to an exit. It can lead to an exit, but it should lead to an inflection point that creates value within the company.
Good question, James. Pertinent for you, for sure. Anything else?
Stop sharing.
Oh, yeah, I guess that's it. Thank you. Yeah, I'll reiterate that comment. Thank you so much, Anurag. Great presentation. Really, really well done. John, you want to just mention something about the recording and how it's available out after the fact here?
Yeah, we'll send it out by email. We'll also make it available on the Rogel Cancer Center Innovation website. And while there, I'll invite you to join us next week for our next lecture.
And I'm happy to send the presentation over to you guys and you can distribute. There's nothing confidential.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Have a great day.